Good afternoon, and welcome to the Tuesday night lecture series sponsored by the Natalie and James Thompson Gallery at San Jose State University. Tonight, we're delighted to host Mindy Seu. The designer will speak for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll have a Q&A after. Please post questions to the Q&A function below at any time. Mindy Seu is a designer and researcher. She holds a master's in design from Harvard's Graduate School of Design and a BA in Design Media Arts from the University of California, Los Angeles. As a fellow at the Harvard Law School's Berkman Klein Center for the Internet and Society, she began an archive of global cyberfeminism spanning 3 decades, becoming the Cyberfeminism Index, commissioned by Rhizome for New Museum's First Look. She has also been a fellow at the Internet Archive, co-organizing the arts track of the inaugural Decentralized Web Summit. Formerly, she was a designer on 2x4's interactive media team and the Museum of Modern Art's in-house design studio. Seu is currently on the faculty at Rutger's Mason Gross School of the Arts and also teaches at the Yale School of Art. And now, please give a warm welcome to Mindy Seu.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Elena, for the introduction. So today I was planning on just screen sharing, and we can walk through these different projects. So what I like particularly about browsers is that they're really just page viewers. So I've kind of separated this talk into 5 small chapters, and I'll kind of run through them fairly quickly. I haven't timed this before, but I'll keep my eye on the clock. I'm currently in upstate New York, so this might go from my time until 8:45, your time until 5:45. But these are also live links. So throughout the talk, I'll also be dropping some links into the chat, though I seem to have lost it right now. There it is. So for this first chapter, I'll focus on the Cyberfeminism Index. If you go to mindyseu.com/sharing, you'll see this webpage. It's a long scroll with some iframes. For this, if you want to peek under the hood, you might be able to see the HTML. I can minimize this a bit because I'm getting this alert. So in the HTML, as comments, which are basically just notes to the coders or programmers, you'll see all of my lecture notes. So feel free to refer to that if you want any of the links. To get to here, you just right click and say, view page source or inspect element, depending on what browser you're on. And just a quick shout out to Emma Ray Brummel. This lecture's HTML comments was inspired by the talk I saw from them for Melanie Hoff's School for Poetic Computation course called Digital Love Languages. Emma's workshop is called Handmade Web. And you can see that link here. So the Cyberfeminism Index, as Elena mentioned in the intro, was created in 2019 at the Berkeley Klein Center. And it was really trying to revise internet history. Typically, when we hear of internet history, we really think about the grandfathers and the protocols who have created, or the grandfathers who have created the architecture and protocol. So the Cyberfeminism Index was trying to think of the application layer of the stack. How is this website, or how is the internet and digital tools used by different groups, and how does it then affect those groups? So it first began as this spreadsheet, which was largely open source. Even now, as you've come into the page, I can see your little avatars. And you can see at the top that there's quite a bit of filters. The purple is yak or hack. That was Judy Malloy's distinction between theory and practice. Yak being yak, 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 and hack, like physical hacking. And the blue topics here are all of the different categories. So this ranged from artificial intelligence to human-computer interaction, cyborgian theory, FLOSS, free Libre open source software, etc. And the green are all different media types. So this would be various directors, hacker spaces, collectives, etc. So if you kind of scroll through, there's hundreds of different entries, but if you scroll vertically, you'll find that they don't necessarily fit cleanly into singular categories. And this was what kind of one of the struggles with creating this type of index in a spreadsheet, because when spreadsheets were first created, they were kind of intended to be these liberatory devices, right? Programming for the masses. But then as you continue to use these things, you find that their rigidity and like their interconnections actually silos things even further. So unless something fits cleanly into a certain category, then you kind of have to slot things in, and it doesn't really leave much space for these things that bleed between categories. I've also placed some references in here that I won't dig into too deeply, but could be a good starting place for you. So throughout this talk, I have various arena channels. This one is by Corey Tiegler called Radical Google Docs. If you go to this link, then you'll basically find a lot of other examples of people using Google Docs, Google Spreadsheets, Google Slides as ways of disseminating large PDF libraries or radical design timelines, Black-owned farms and gardens, spreadsheet directories, etc. So if you want more reading reference to syllabi, I definitely suggest checking out this channel. So the second iteration after the spreadsheet was this print-on-demand catalog. So this was only around 10 or 20 copies, and it was using a print-on-demand service called the Espresso Book Machine. And what we were trying to do is really determine how might the form change, or how might this data translate depending on what form it's in. So here you're kind of seeing like the larger pull quotes interspersed throughout these things. You might also get a sense that the books themselves are very lo-fi because it was using this print-on-demand tool. And for a proof of concept, that's really all you needed. So the first half of the book was focusing on what we called artifacts. And the center of the book we called the index. And you'll see here that we kind of have a multi-column structure with this indexical spine down the middle. Typically I do a reading from this book, but just for the sake of time, I might scrub through this pretty quickly. It's a little hard to tell from the side or from this smaller view, but there's also these embedded cross-references. So cross-references are early examples of hyperlinks, and it kind of encourages non-linear reading. So I'll show an example down below, but it would allow you to hop around different parts of the book. So these are some examples from the first half of the book. So excerpts from the 21st century, or the Cyberfeminist Manifesto for the 21st century, excuse me, I've been on Zoom all day. I'll give you a closer look at that down below. And as mentioned, what we're calling artifacts are some of the smaller items that are typically lost on web pages. Web pages typically die because the internet changes so quickly. So a lot of these are screen grabs from web recorders like Rhizome's web recorder, now called Conifer, or the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. These are actually screenshots of websites. So if you have loose images or icons or logos, a lot of these things get flattened and lost. So I did my best to kind of find all of those loose artifacts and keep them in the highest resolution possible at the first half of this book. So for example, these are stills from Mary Magic's open source estrogen. Mary Magic is really focusing on hormone hacking and how we might disseminate hormone therapy online. And the second half of the book, you see these larger screenshots. So this is a screen grab from the Museum of Menstruation. a lot of e-literature examples as seen here. The 100 antitheses, I'll talk about this down below as well, but this was created for the first Cyberfeminist International. Rather than trying to define what cyberfeminism was, it instead gave 100 reasons as to what it was not, trying to encourage this multiplicity and self-defining from the actual participants. And at the end, it ends with this cyberfeminism ? Artifact, also found on that Old Boys Network site. Again, because they didn't have a clear definition, they were really trying to determine what cyberfeminism might include and be very open to its evolution. I'll quickly give a definition of cyberfeminism before doing this little detour into the history of spreadsheets. So cyberfeminism might best be understood through breaking apart the word itself. The first part, cyber, is the prefix. Cyber first originated in cybernetics in the 1940s by, wow, I'm blanking here. Wow, sorry about that. Again, it's late in New York time, so I might have hit my peak for the end of the day. Sorry, Norbert Wiener's cybernetics, wow. So cybernetics was really about feedback loops. It was understanding how people could affect a system and the system could actually infect that person. So it's the cyclical thing rather than like a top-down theory. Cyber was then used for cyberspace in William Gibson's Neuromancer. This was this really big boom in science fiction, and it was really important for a lot of reasons, but Neuromancer was also very male-gazy. So you had fembots and cyber babes and a lot of other characters that kind of depicted a male, cis, white, male-centric view of what the future might include. So when cyber was then fixed to feminism in the early 90s, this became a provocation. How could women or other marginalized people imagine what cyberspace might look like? How could you use technology while also being critical of it? Hence that feedback loop again. And since then, since the early 90s, it's kind of evolved and is still continuing today, though in a much different form because the internet has changed so much since 1991 when cyberfeminism was coined. So a quick detour about spreadsheets. So this is a still from VisiCalc. This was the first digital spreadsheet that shipped with Apple II in the 1970s. But spreadsheets really took hold when they were incorporated into IBM's PC in the 1980s. And this was the first GUI-based spreadsheet. So GUI stands for Graphical User Interface. This is basically all the styling that we see. So people who don't know how to use Terminal or Linux might understand what they're looking at. So for example, when I go to my sidebars on this side, if you scroll down to your dock and a trash can appears, you understand that it's representing a trash can, even if that's really just an icon representing a command. So I wanted to read this quote by Ted Nelson. Again, when spreadsheets first appeared in the 70s, it was considered functional programming for the masses. Now anyone could actually use a spreadsheet or do very simple computations online. But these conventional data structures, especially tables and arrays, are confined structures created from a rigid top-down specification that enforces regularity and rectangularity. This is by Ted Nelson, who is considered the father of hypertext and hyperlinks, the concept of. We'll talk about that more in a bit as well. So when Ted Nelson was conceiving of hyperlinks, which we really take for granted on the internet today, he was really inspired by the Talmud. So this is a still one page from the Talmud, which is the primary theological and religious doctrine of Judaism. And the structure in itself, the center, you have the Mishnah. The outermost columns, you have scholars commenting on the Mishnah. And in the outermost column, you have comments on the comments. So built into the structure of the page, you have this dialectic of different opinions. This is actually Ted Nelson holding up a still from the Talmud. So He has this funny YouTube channel called, I believe it's The Real Ted Nelson. Yeah, so you can see this link here. It's called Xanadu Basics, Visible Connection. So a lot of the people who think about these precursors for a lot of these internet technologies and methods typically began from a lot of proto-internets or analog tools. So this is a screen grab from the Whole Earth catalog where you have these different cross-references where if you were on a certain section of the page, this is page 70, and you wanted to learn more about another topic like restoration forestry, you can jump to that part of the page. So again, encouraging non-linear reading. And that's essentially what the Talmud is doing, baked into the page. That's also what things like footnotes, encyclopedias, indexes, all of these things have existed. This idea of flipping through pages and referencing different parts of a large body of work. This is another still from a cyberfeminism book, in which they call this icon a hypertextual link. And here, this would appear in the margins throughout the book, so you can kind of, again, hop around these different sections. So Ted Nelson also, not only did he conceive of the concept of hypertext and hyperlinks, he also thought of his version of the internet, which was called Xanadu. This is a still of Xanadu. Xanadu was really thinking about two-way links. So two-way links meant that, well, first let's talk about the layout of this page. In some ways, it's pretty similar to the websites we typically use today. In the center, you have a large scrolling page. But here, instead of links being a blue link that has that underline, you instead have these highlights that also then connect to the original source. And not only the direct link, it's also showing the context in which it appeared. So in this linking, it also created a two-way link. So if I cited this link, then it would be fortified and agreed upon by the other side. In our current version of the web, created by Tim Berners-Lee and some other figures, we use the World Wide Web. I don't have it in front of here, but typically you would see it like this. So this World Wide Web uses one-way links. What this means is if you link to a site and for whatever reason it degrades, let's say I was linking to the SJSU art gallery and the domain name changes or the site becomes inundated, that link would rot. And that means if you click to it from my page, the link dies. The link goes nowhere. You get a 404. So this was really thinking about how you might use citations and embody it into the formation of the web itself, rather than kind of treating it as an afterthought. It really makes me think about how we visualize citation. So here, this is a different view of Xanadu called Xanadu space. This is the three-dimensional view where, again, you have your primary page, and all of your citations have a visible connection to its original source. This idea of three-dimensionality is not unique to Ted Nelson. At the same time, Muriel Cooper, who was a researcher at MIT Media Lab, created the Visible Language Workshop. This was also thinking about how to incorporate time, media, and depth into these digital interfaces. And a lot of this kind of thinking is lost today. You still have explorations into VR and AR and maybe some depth, but for the most part, a lot of the website templates that we use are pretty two-dimensional. And just a quick, another reference if you want to use it, Sal Hammerman created a channel called The Politics of Citation with a lot of people. So please feel free to check out this link if you want more references on why who you cite is a reflection of your personal politics and how we might examine those things. So not only was I thinking about how to visualize citations, I'm also very curious about how websites age. So here, this was again that screenshot that was incorporated in the printed book above. This is the 100 Antitheses by the Old Boys Network. So again, instead of creating one definition as to what cyberfeminism includes, it created 100 definitions as to what it did not, or what it was not, the 100 Antitheses. This site was created in '97 for the first Cyberfeminist International and works pretty perfectly today. It's all hard-coded. It uses default web colors. It uses default web fonts. This is just Arial bold. And it uses default HTML form fields. So this drop-down menu and the list elements and things like this. What this means is now, after over two decades, the website still works perfectly. It's not using a lot of third-party JavaScript libraries or new programming languages that maybe aren't updated and die out faster. So HTML and CSS are largely considered the backbone of today's web, if you're thinking about styling and things like this, and JavaScript. So another reference for how websites age is this net art piece from 1997 called Form Art, by Alexei Shulgin. Let me make this a touch smaller. So form art, instead of styling, well, first he was trying to reappropriate these bureaucratic form elements. So things like buttons, text fields, drop-down items, things like this. He actually used as different drawing tools. So instead of changing he actually did change the function. So you can change the composition. Now these buttons become different parts of a letter form. And again, even with this project, it's a little washed out on the screen, but now if you go to the website, it appears like this. Because as the browser has updated over the span of 2 decades, this project has updated as well. Because he wasn't changing the styling of different form elements, he was only changing its position. I actually highly encourage you to dig into this link and click around. It has a lot of animations and illustrations and things like this. So I didn't embed it for various reasons, but I recommend checking out this link. But what I like about this is by embracing these browser updates, he's letting the website kind of design itself. And this is definitely something I was thinking about as well when going into the Cyberfeminism Index. This is actually a live link. I will load it here. I might chug a little bit because I have a lot of tabs open. So when you first arrive at the site, it appears like a standard index. But as you move around, the site kind of comes alive and it responds to your movements. And this was intentional. As you kind of click through these different entries, you're also added to this side panel, which we're calling the trail. And this was also kind of based off of a lot of philosophies that Arena uses about learning trails, how you can create associative links between different things, even if you're kind of browsing through in a haphazard way. Of course, you can click through things intentionally, but even if you are just kind of browsing, what types of connections could you build through these intuitive linking systems? So several of these are excerpts to incorporate a variety of voices. Many have images. We could also toggle to the images view. So you can kind of get a survey of a lot of the different styles that were coming out of cyberfeminism from the 90s till today. And what you can also download this PDF. This also might take a while. We found a bug earlier, so I wonder how quickly it will load. So what it tells you is the number of entries downloaded, your timestamp, and all the different things that you collected. So I'm very pro piracy. It kind of would allow you to download your own reader, make your own booklet. Paul Sewellis describes downloading as an act of resistance, especially in a time when we don't really own a lot of our own content anymore. But in this side panel also, you could also view all downloads. So here you can get a sense of how many people have downloaded content since the site went live in October. I actually haven't seen this recently, so I'm curious who or how many. So it seems like the last downloads were yesterday. It's great to see. I'm going to X out of this. These are some videos if you want to get a different sense, plus captions. I also wanted to just quickly talk through some of the examples that are included in the index. So this is a still or artifact from Bindi Girl by Prema Murthy, who was really thinking about the fetishization of East or South Asian women online, especially with the rise of porn in like the late 90s, and especially it's pretty rampant today. So she was trying to kind of reclaim this and to empower her community. This is a still from Clau Kinki's Brutal Myths, which was thinking about the history of obstetrics. One of the artifacts and primary word mark of Cyber Powwow, one of the first Indigenous online networks in Canada by Scawanetti. A screenshot from the African Declaration of Internet Rights and Freedoms. Also thinking about how certain gender norms are embedded in the hardware and software we use. So for example, this tool itself is actually called a gender changer. You can plug in different chords into this to basically change a male from a female or etc. If you think about an outlet, those kind of inserts are called female, where it's the actual plug is called male. So again, we're really thinking not only are computers binary, but this binary norms are built into the language of our hardware as well. And this was actually reclaimed then and used as the icon for a hacker space in Europe called Gender Changers Academy. Mujeres in Red is another hack feminist group in Latin America. They tend to use the terms hack feminist or techno feminist rather than cyber feminist. And this is a screen grab. I love how lo-fi it is. The women's web ring, again, www. So this was at a time when you wanted to kind of show the networks that you were part of. So if I had a personal web page up, I would include this artifact. And if you clicked it, you would be randomly sent to another person who was part of that network. So instead of showing like Instagram's recommendations, it was trying to show some intentional curation as to who was part of certain communities and trying to build in a sense of locality into this very ephemeral space. And finally, I wanted to show this artifact. So this is actually was at the very bottom of a website by Gash Girl. And Gash Girl was an early net artist who was part of VNS Matrix, which was kind of a play on DNS, domain name service. And when I first saw this, I just thought the render was so beautiful. So as a gift, I'm actually going to stop sharing quickly. My friend Laura Combs 3D printed it for me for Christmas. It was intended to be a bracelet, but it's a bit large. But I also was trying to think about like how we can think about the second lives of these things, or the third lives, or the fourth lives. I'm going to screen share again. So Laura and I are part of a group called CSS. We like the name CSS because we're all web people. We teach interactive media. As mentioned, HTML and CSS are kind of the building blocks of the web. It also is for our last names, Combs, Schwartz, Sue. And in this, we were really thinking, we kind of picked this favicon here on a whim. We liked it because it was like 3 separate islands that created a line. It's called the downright diagonal ellipses. And as we were digging into this more, we realized it was part of a matrix. So this matrix kind of in mathematics represented and so forth. It represented a void. And we thought that perhaps this diagonal ellipses might represent or be a representative of an unstable sign, which I kind of will get to in a bit. We actually adopted this from the Unicode Foundation. You're actually allowed to purchase glyphs. So I highly recommend, this is a great gift for people. It's kind of like buying someone a star or buying someone a tree. You can buy them a Unicode character as well. So on the Unicode site, yeah, we're here as bronze sponsors. So an unstable sign was Sheila Legrand-Brettful's idea of how you can use a ubiquitous character, like an ellipses, like a question mark, to kind of shake up the way we actually read text and represent and so forth, and represent more. When Sheila was talking about just the normal ... ellipses, she was saying it was meant to include all the people who had been excluded. It was a kind of way of saying this is not complete. This can incorporate as many other people as see themselves in this text. So if anything, we're kind of building upon this to think of this ... Laura and I were also thinking about how this might be included for other forms like the asterisk. So recently we did a workshop for the Southland Institute called multidimensional dot link, which I'll also throw into the chat. So one moment. So what we first did was start off by having everyone draw their name using the Zoom annotation tool. It was a pretty big workshop. We had 35 people. So everyone drew their name and added drew their line and added their name, and it became this collective mark, a very cacophonous, vibrant collective mark. We then went into a workshop. I wanted to quickly just show our Arena channel to show the lecture that we gave and call out a few things. This actually does read in chronological order if you would like to read through this channel. Oops. Sorry, the dangers of using live links. Sorry, there it is. Here we go. Oh, sorry, my website or my site, my screens are kind of glitching. Let me try this one more time. I don't know why it's not liking my second monitor. Sorry about that. For some reason, it's snapping to my site, but I'm just going to quickly show the final product. So the multidimensional link workshop was trying to think about how we can create an online group publication. Yeah, I'll just maximize it so we don't have to worry about it freaking out. So here, the asterisk itself, you might find at the end of a line. So thinking about secondary text. So here we are kind of trying to reclaim this or think about how it can foreground secondary text at the same level as a primary text. Really thinking about citations and annotations as a form of authorship, especially as part of a collective publication. So first, people picked various excerpts from around their space to use as this base layer text, which I have toggled on. And then as people were, for their first prompt, we were basically asked everyone to give the citation for what this thing was. So for example, in this initial quote, I generally have 4 or 5 books open around the house. They don't relate to each other, and the ideas they present bounce off of one another. And I like this effect. So I guess in that way, I'm using a kind of primitive hypertext. This was actually by Octavia Butler in conversation with Samuel Delany, both science fiction authors, for MIT in 1998. We also asked people to give other annotations in the form of image files and audio files. So Kate, accompanied by her 10-year-old sister, created this instruction for asterisks.
I'm going to teach you how to find your correct posture because you seem to be very stiff. You have to remove yourself from the HTML so you can stand up. You rise your 2 asterisk arms to the heavens and put them together. Then you slowly release them back down horizontally, creating one line from your left asterisk arm to your right asterisk arm. Then slowly release your arms back down to normal. You have found your correct posture. If you couldn't understand that, then too bad. You must not have very good posture, oh well. You are such an asterisk.
And participants like Rhizome created different tools for, sorry, I heard a doorbell. I don't know if that's for the other panelists. Lisa Mayon basically created images to figure out how to connect different parts of the text. So if you clicked these images, it would expand, and she would try to, through intuition, and again, through association, connect these different terms to represent different knowledge maps. And she had some more abstract ones like this. So what I like about this is as you toggle on everyone's name, you can see the website grow. And you begin to see how much secondary text has populated this online publication, how many different forms of reading are included, especially as you're able to toggle off the base layer, which is that black text. So once that's off, then all you see is the secondary text. We also then included this feature with our developer, Richard Caceres, where if you toggled off everyone's name as well as the base layer, only the asterisks would remain. So he initially asked, do you want a button that can turn all of them off at once? And we decided no, because we liked how methodical it was to see them all quickly disappear. So at the end, you only have these representations of marks of what these asterisks might have been. And it feels kind of like a nighttime sky. All right. So for the last bit, I'm just going to run through quickly. For some reason, my browser is very unhappy. There we go. Okay. We have about 4-ish minutes, so I'm going to very quickly talk about 2 projects that I did, one early last year, one late last year. So Print Arena was a very short project. If you go to printarena.com, you can basically print out any of your arena channels. This was done by with Ekene Ijeoma and Charles Bruskowski, and you can see some other credits and links at the bottom. If you plug in a channel, I created this with David Reinfurt and Charles Bruskowski. It basically generates a PDF. You can then print this using Lulu, which is a print-on-demand service. We thought hard copy was kind of meta as a content source for this particular channel, because we were thinking about soft copies, which is the malleable, ephemeral, different digital-based publications that you see, versus the hard copy, the very fixed, printed, non-changing publication that we typically know of as a book or a printout. And we also had an opening at ORG, which is a small software shop on the Lower East Side in Manhattan. This is kind of an example of what it looks like, the printed publication, and how it looks in Arena's studio, which no longer exists now, which is quite sad. All right, so finally, I wanted to talk about one of the primary themes of my work in the past year, which has really been thinking about gathering. I think when you tend to think of gathering, you think of the gatherer, such as the hunter-gatherer. And for this, I like referencing this quote by Ursula Le Guin. She wrote a book called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, which reimagines the first tool as the basket rather than the spear, which ultimately reframes the first protagonist as not the hunter, but as the gatherer, as the person who tends to their farms and bring this energy back home. And I wanted to read a big small quote from that text. This was by their recent publisher, Ignota Books, though the original text came out in the 80s. Before the tool that forces energy outward, we made the tool that brings energy home. Prior to the preeminence of sticks, swords, and the heroes' killing tools, our ancestors' greatest invention was the container, the basket of wild oats, the medicine bundle, the net made of your own hair, the bag of stars. And this bag of stars is really what we were after when doing the Southland Institute workshop at that very end, when you kind of get the starry sky in a browser. It's also the subject of my latest class for Yale University. So this is, I can paste this into the chat also. This is our online syllabus, which thinks about gathering in two forms, materially and socially. So not only can you gather, in this case, digital objects to create a physical collection or a digital collection, you could also gather and activate these collections through a social gathering. So gathering as a digital collection and gathering as a virtual event. We're halfway through. I'm sure all of you are used to experiencing school online as well. And most recently, we also created the scalability project with the AIR gallery in Dumbo, New York. So this was with Roxana Fabius and Patricia M. Hernandez. I'll paste this in the chat as well. It was an online publication that is now currently getting installed in their gallery, but has been kind of rolling out pieces twice a month for the past several months. And not only are they commissioned online works, there are also some new interviews. And the latest is with organizer Adrienne Marie Brown, excuse me. So Adrienne Marie Brown wrote pleasure activism, and in her text, in her byline, it actually says written and gathered by Adrienne Marie Brown. It might be gathered and edited, actually. But when we interviewed her, she had this great quote. I think of a relationship like a spider web, something that can look very diaphanous and tender, but that's actually extremely strong because of the material and the time and the energy that was put into it. I love the idea of webbing. This is kind of a nice metaphor when thinking about networks also. And with CSS, Laura and Laurel, we're also thinking about citational networks. So how can we intentionally expand what we're reading in order to catch the things that would branch off of that network? Bruno Latour describes networks as a set of associations that leads to more associations. So if you're only reading a certain type of person or looking at a work of a certain type of person, you're only going to continue to see that. You'll be stuck in an echo chamber. So if you branch out intentionally, then you can begin to cultivate new works. So this is something that I'm writing about for Shift Space, which is the inaugural publication for the Knight Fellowship. And this is actually coming out next week. So if you keep your eye on this link, then you'll see that essay in a couple weeks, organized and edited by Salome Esega, and a lot of these other writers, artists, and curators. And I think with that, that's all I have for you. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Mindy, so much for that lecture and for being so generous too in all you've shared with us. I really hope that all students who are here today will have some time to follow up with some of these links and really explore them on their own, because there's just so much even outside the confines of what you've been able to say, and which is so central to the way in which you've shared this talk. We're joined today by Diane Lee and Rhonda Holberton, a few of our professors here at SJSU. And I also invite all of our students to submit any questions that you have in the Q&A. It looks like we already had one while you were speaking, so let me read it out and start us off. Which part of your process is most enjoyable for you and why? Research, experimentation, or the final result?
I kind of see it as almost like different projects, each of these different steps. And they're all enjoyable for such different reasons. I think especially as these projects get really, really long. So Cyberfem is running over, it almost feels like over 2 years now, maybe it's not that long. So it does seem like as long as you're able to find some sort of joy in either of these, any of these steps, it feels like a different manifestation. I personally love the conversational research phase. I think that's when you're kind of brimming with all of these different ideas and potential. The beginning, I'm sure many people think kind of drags on. It feels like kind of the manual labor of trying to execute something. I think the beginning takes about 80% of your energy, and then the end, or sorry, 20% of the project requires 80% of your energy. I kind of forget that quote. But I definitely prefer the very beginning. It feels like the most rush of energy.
Thank you. So this question is following up on something you briefly mentioned, which is your love for piracy. And so Zach Whitworth writes, where do you think piracy of materials from the internet fits in with social political action?
Wow, I mean, if you think about some early online activism, so for example, Aaron Schwartz and JSTOR, this was, a lot of these things are inside walled gardens. So JSTOR, for those who don't know, is an academic journal store, like a storehouse. And you can only have access if you have certain institutional accreditation. So what he was trying to say is information should be free. If certain institutions are already paying for it, then why can't everyone have access for it? As long as the original authors get compensated. But at this time, they were really cracking down on piracy, and they wanted to make a lesson of this person. So they sentenced him to prison, and he ultimately committed suicide. So I think if you think about this motif, people are just trying to disseminate information because information is power. So I think in this way, piracy is not about stealing from authors and not giving them credit. It's about disseminating information and also giving credit where credit is due.
Thank you. And one more question here in the Q&A from Chako Shimoto. Thank you, Mindy, for the wonderful lecture. I was wondering, where and how did you gather the content in your website?
Chako, nice to see you again. I know yesterday we met briefly in Diane's class. Where did I get the web information? So for Cyberfeminism Index, it really started off with reading and scraping bibliographies, and then realizing that the content was very academic and that the ethos of Cyberfem was very practice-based. So again, that distinction between yak and hack. You need theory and practice. there's this old publication called the New Woman Survival Catalog. And when they were creating it, Susan Rennie and Kirsten Grimstad, their advisor told them that a revolution could only happen grassroots. It could not happen within an institution. So they took their bibliography and they got in a car and drove across the US and compiled all the contents for this catalog. So I like to think I did the digital version of that. I don't drive, I don't have a car, but I did talk to hundreds of different people, and I basically just aggregated all of their information, their reading lists, and references. So it really did network and spiderweb out like that. I mean, I'm still doing it and the project is still going on. It kind of feels like this never ending dig, but it's really the most exciting part of the project, talking to a lot of different people. There's also a submission button on the site. So since the site went live, we've gotten around 200 submissions, which is a great response as well.
Thank you. Well, while our students are thinking up a few more questions, Diane and Rhonda, do you have anything you wanted to ask or comment on?
I have so many questions, so it's hard to think of just one to share now, but I think this maybe builds on Chaco's question, which is about your, like, the mundane methods that you use, because I think one of the things that I find so inspiring about your work is the generosity in the citations and making those citations available so we can follow along your learning path. And so I'm just wondering if there are any things that you do that we could learn from to organize our own learning paths and learning paths. Yeah, I'll end there.
Yeah, well, just to quickly comment on the mundane part, Shannon Mattern has a great text on the importance of maintenance. So even though I just gave a lot of hype for this original, like, moonshot idea, really the labor of love comes through making it happen and maintaining it after it's been launched. So I think that maybe that's something that students should consider more. In terms of the process, I think that there's so much information online. The most important thing you can try or focus on is the method of recall. So for example, Internet Archive has a ton of information on Wayback Machine and on their online digital archive, but their search function is actually quite poor. And they know this. This is kind of what they're putting their energy towards right now. I did a fellowship with them years ago. And if you know what you're looking for, you can find it. But even then, you have to be very particular with the language. So I think that even for yourselves, I feel like students of mine, especially the younger ones, go straight for the search tool, like Spotlight on their MacBooks, and they don't use like a system of like files and folders anymore, which for me is mind-boggling because everything I have is nested to like an nth degree. So for me, I nest everything and that literally creates a trail. I think that would be much harder for me if it was purely based on naming and recollection. So I would encourage all of you to create literal paths. This will help when you learn how to code, and this will definitely help with file management.
That actually dovetails with the question I have. Hi, lovely, lovely presentation. So there's the kind of act of like stewardship of kind of maintenance, of mending, of caring, and then there's also the, you know, the gathering, right, and the kind of assimilating and the kind of making nodes, which is kind of like an exploratory and kind of a process of new making. Where, and you kind of alluded to this in your last comment about, you know, like file paths. There's a reason why younger students, you know, use Spotlight. One, they don't have the accumulation in the same way, and then two, like their minds are just more plastic, like plastic and flexible. And so, how do you see like memory kind of interacting and engage, like biomemory, and the way that we kind of like make reality from memory interacting with some of these themes?
Yeah, I mean, who said this? Memory work. I forget who said the quote, like, memory work is a form of activism. I wish I could recall that speaker. But because memory is so malleable, this has kind of become, there's been a huge uptick in oral storytelling or oral histories as a discipline. I think it first came out in the 80s, but now it's more rapidly used, especially for like grassroots community archiving. So in this case, before it was documented and transcribed or even recorded, it was purely passed on generation through generation as a story, as like a mnemonic device. So I recently wrote a paper with Amelia Winger-Bearskin, who is a technologist. She has a great podcast with Indigenous technologists called Wampum Codes. Highly recommend. I can type that in the chat as well. But she said she's an Indigenous New Yorker. She calls herself a Native New Yorker as a joke, but she was saying that in her tribe, they actually think of storytelling to pass along 7 generations. So not only do you have to think about 7 generations past, but you think about 7 generations in the future. And when you're designated as a storyteller, you're also, it's almost considered an honor. You're not meant to memorize the story verbatim. You're meant to adapt it to contemporary times. So you are almost a translator to see it in a new context. So I wonder if this really focuses on this idea of biomemory, right? Like, if you remember something, it's because it mattered greatly to you. They say that when you don't learn things in class, it's not because you're not good at it. It's just because it wasn't presented in a way that you find currently relevant. And you might follow up with it later and realize, oh, this actually feels like an epiphany to me. So I think in that way, creating some sort of memory device for transfer for yourself later and also for your peers is also really, really generous. And I think this coincides with like note-taking and paths and et cetera. But even learning trails for Arena and for my own work, that's really based on like doing things intuitively and then trusting that there's kind of a through line through those things. So I don't think you have to conceptualize all of it up front. I think that if you do a lot of disparate things and you reflect on it, there will inevitably be some sort of through line, whether you intended it or not.
Oh, I was muted. It looks like we have time for one final question here in the Q&A from Mary Gutierrez, who writes, what do you consider when presenting artifacts in terms of user interaction? For example, allowing visitors to download a PDF of visited links in the Cyberfeminism Index.
Well, I think because interacting with artifacts. If you put something online, most likely it will get taken anyway. It's so easy to take a screenshot, look at the source code, download the entire web page, download a PDF of the web page. So if anything, I think encouraging this and making it look the way you want to as designers is valuable. But also to say, like, there's been this huge resurgence, or not resurgence, a huge start to museums actually opening their doors and putting all of their metadata for their entire collection online and making it open source. So for example, the Met has thousands of entries of metadata on GitHub that you can just download. And I think it's because they're recognizing that provenance, it doesn't really matter if you're guarding this and locking your door and forcing people to walk in your doors. If anything, letting people see all of this and have some stake in it will make them actually invest more into what you're claiming as valuable. So I think it ultimately just comes down to sharing. And in my case, I think that downloading is a form of sharing. This idea of copies, I think, is maybe, I don't want to get into NFTs. I don't know if people are following this. But ultimately, yeah, copies are prolific online, and I think encouraging it is really important.
It's too bad you don't want to get into NFTs, because I feel like, you know, in this space, it's actually a much, like, coming from that perspective, this is where NFTs are actually quite interesting, right? Whereas
Absolutely, right.
kind of collective stewardship, collective ownership, and I don't know if you know Kalani Nicole, who had Transfer Gallery and also was part of the current museum, who's trying to reimagine what it meant to be like a patron of the arts or a collector of the arts. Whereas rather than ownership isn't like, I own this, it's in my house, nobody else can see it, but it's like, I'm a steward of this thing. I am a supporter of, and a patron. So thinking about ways that those things intersect.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of a friend of mine, Haley Lohman, runs Los Angeles Contemporary Archive. Yeah. And she was talking about Post-Custodial Archives, which is this new form where instead of plundering, extracting resources and goods from neighboring regions, you kind of go in, they say it's valuable, so you help them scan it, create an online database, and you own the digital files, but they get to keep the physical objects. And I think this is kind of like a beautiful pairing, because you can disseminate it, but you don't actually have to remove it from a region and say it's valuable because it's in a vitrine. So I think that that balance feels quite nice, even if a lot of people criticize it because the object will degrade faster. But I don't think things are meant to last forever anyway.
Well, thank you. On that note, we do have to end our discussion today, but it's been really wonderful having you here today, Mindy. And for anyone here, we will be able to have this talk later on YouTube, and you'll have all the links. So please continue engaging with this conversation, continue engaging with Mindy's work. And we are available to provide you with any additional links as you go on. And so thank you so much to Mindy. Thank you to Diane and Rhonda, and to all of our participants today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Mindy.